The Egyptians say they don't want every artifact back from the British Museum, just those of significant archaeological value, like the Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
Rosetta Stone.
The Rosetta Stone
is the Rosetta Stone. It was the key to understanding Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it is one of the most precious and valuable treasures of the British Museum.
For more than 200 years, the world believed the mystery of the Rosetta Stone had already been solved. Scholars translated it. Museums displayed it. History books closed the case. But what if the most famous inscription in human history was never fully understood at all? Before we begin, subscribe to the channel, because this discovery may completely change what we think we know about ancient Egypt. Recently, an advanced AI system was trained on the Rosetta Stone's full trilingual inscription, and almost immediately it detected something that generations of human experts had missed. The hieroglyphic text and the Greek translation are not actually saying the same thing, not in the passages that matter most. According to the AI, the message hidden inside the stone may contain a second layer of meaning buried beneath the official translation taught for nearly 2 centuries. If true, it would mean the ancient scribes who carved this stone were not simply recording a political decree. They may have been encoding information for a completely different audience, one nobody in the modern world ever suspected. More than 2,000 years ago, somewhere inside an Egyptian workshop lit by oil lamps and desert sunlight, master scribes began carving symbols into a slab of black granodiorite stone. They were carving for kings, for priests, for future generations, for people they would never meet. Then the stone vanished beneath the sands of history for nearly 1,500 years, until a French soldier's shovel struck something hard near the Egyptian town of Rosetta in the summer of 1799. At first glance, it looked unimpressive, broken, damaged, incomplete. But carved across its surface were 3 separate scripts carrying what appeared to be the same message. That discovery became the key that unlocked the lost language of ancient Egypt and changed history forever. But now, 2 centuries later, artificial intelligence is forcing historians to ask a terrifying question. What if the Rosetta Stone still has secrets left to reveal? What happened after the discovery of the Rosetta Stone shaped the entire future of the artifact? Following Napoleon's defeat in Egypt, the British claimed the stone under the 1801 Treaty of Alexandria and transported it to London. Since 1802, it has remained on display inside the British Museum, becoming one of the most continuously exhibited objects on Earth. Over the last 2 centuries, millions of visitors have stood inches away from it. Historians, linguists, and archaeologists examined every visible mark across its surface. And for generations, the academic world believed the mystery had already been solved. The Rosetta Stone was seen as a completed puzzle, a breakthrough that had already revealed all its secrets. But now, that certainty is beginning to crack, because the force challenging it is not human. It does not inherit assumptions, follow tradition, or rely on centuries of accepted interpretation. The system now reanalyzing the stone approaches the text without the intellectual baggage that shaped earlier scholarship. And to understand why this matters so much, you have to realize how completely humanity once lost the ability to read the language carved into that stone. This was not a small missing piece of history. It was a total collapse of knowledge. For hundreds of years, travelers entered Egypt and stared at enormous temples, towering obelisks, and underground tombs covered wall to wall with strange symbols: birds, serpents, eyes, human figures, waves, geometric markings. The carvings were clearly meaningful, clearly sacred, but nobody on earth could understand what they said. The writing system had become completely silent. The final known person capable of reading ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics is believed to have died sometime around 394 AD. After that, the knowledge disappeared. As Roman influence spread and Christianity transformed the region, ancient temples were abandoned or destroyed. The priestly scribes who had dedicated their lives to mastering the sacred script vanished, and with them vanished the ability to read nearly 5,000 years of Egyptian history. Imagine that for a second. Entire dynasties, scientific records, religious beliefs, royal decrees, poems, stories, everything locked away behind symbols nobody could decode. And the most frustrating part is that scholars never stopped trying. For more than 1,000 years, brilliant minds attempted to break the system. Medieval Islamic researchers carefully studied the inscriptions and failed to uncover the method. During the Renaissance, European collectors transported Egyptian monuments across Europe, displaying them proudly while having no idea what a single inscription meant. By the 1700s, respected intellectuals were publishing elaborate explanations of hieroglyphics with complete confidence. Almost all of them were wrong. The biggest misunderstanding was the belief that hieroglyphics were purely symbolic. Scholars assumed every image represented an abstract idea rather than spoken language. A hawk symbolized the soul. A snake represented danger. A circle meant eternity. The interpretations sounded mystical and convincing, but they led nowhere. Because hieroglyphics were not simply symbolic art. They were an extraordinarily advanced writing system, combining phonetic sounds, visual symbols, and contextual markers all at once. A single image could function differently depending on where and how it appeared. Without a bridge connecting the script to a known language, the code remained impossible to crack. For 15 centuries, nobody could get through that wall. Then, in 1799, a soldier, digging through the mud near the Egyptian town of Rosetta, accidentally created the first opening. Not enough to reveal everything, just enough to begin. And what modern algorithms may now be detecting inside that opening is something neither the French discoverers nor the scholars of 1822 ever imagined. When experts first began examining the Rosetta Stone, one detail immediately stood out. The inscription was written 3 separate times using 3 completely different scripts. At the top was hieroglyphics, the sacred formal script reserved for temples, religion, and royal monuments. In the center was Demotic, a quicker, everyday form of Egyptian writing used for legal documents, business records, and ordinary communication. And at the bottom was Ancient Greek, the official administrative language of Egypt during the Ptolemaic dynasty, when the rulers of Egypt were descendants of the Greek Empire established after Alexander the Great. And here was the breakthrough that changed history. All 3 sections appeared to contain the exact same message. The Greek text could still be read, which gave scholars their first real foothold. It described a royal decree issued in 196 BC by Egyptian priests honoring the young pharaoh Ptolemy V on the anniversary of his coronation. The inscription celebrated tax reductions, temple privileges, political loyalty, and military achievements in the formal language of royal propaganda. At least, that's what historians believe the stone was saying. The decree itself sounded exactly like the kind of language governments have always produced. It ordered statues of the king to be placed across Egypt, praised the ruler's achievements, outlined temple privileges, and repeated carefully constructed political language. Formal, controlled, bureaucratic. Nothing about it appeared mysterious, but the presence of the Greek text changed everything. Because for the first time in over 15 centuries, scholars could compare a language they understood directly beside one they didn't, line by line, symbol by symbol, word against word. Suddenly, humanity had something it had never possessed before, a guidebook into the lost world of hieroglyphics, and the race to crack the code began immediately. Early progress came from Swedish diplomat Johan Åkerblad, who managed to identify several names within the Demotic script. But the first truly major breakthrough arrived through an unlikely figure, British physicist Thomas Young, and it happened because he noticed one strange detail. In 1814, Young sat surrounded by handwritten copies of the Rosetta Stone inscriptions in his London study when a repeating pattern caught his attention. Certain hieroglyphs kept appearing inside oval-shaped loops known today as cartouches. Every time the Greek text mentioned the name Ptolemy, those same symbols appeared inside the oval. Young realized something revolutionary. If the cartouche represented a royal name, then the symbols inside could not simply stand for ideas or mystical concepts. They had to represent sounds, actual phonetic sounds forming a spoken name. That realization changed history. It wasn't a full translation yet. It wasn't even a complete system. But it was the first real breach in a wall that had stood untouched for nearly 1,500 years. The person who finally shattered that wall completely was a French linguistic genius named Jean-François Champollion. Jean Champollion had cracked the code of hieroglyphics, perhaps the greatest decipherment in history. Unlike most scholars of his time, Champollion understood something crucial. Ancient Egyptian had not vanished entirely. Its final surviving form still existed in Coptic, the liturgical language preserved within Egyptian Christianity, and Champollion had mastered it. That became his secret weapon. Coptic preserved echoes of the original Egyptian pronunciation using the Greek alphabet. For Champollion, it acted like a bridge across time, connecting silent symbols carved into stone with sounds that had not been spoken for centuries. He spent years obsessively studying the problem. Not weeks, not months, years. By September 1822, his workspace in Paris was overflowing with notes and copied inscriptions. Candle wax stained the tables. Sheets of paper covered every surface. He had barely slept. Then suddenly, the final pattern clicked into place. Champollion rushed out of his study, found his brother Jacques-Joseph, grabbed him by the arms, and declared, "Je tiens l'affaire." "I've got it." Then he collapsed unconscious from exhaustion. According to the story, he remained bedridden for 5 days. And when he finally woke up, the first thing he asked was whether his notes were safe. They were. And from that moment on, the ancient Egyptian world was silent no longer. If you enjoy stories where forgotten history collides with modern discovery, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what Champollion unlocked in 1822 may have only been the first layer of the mystery. What happens next is where the story becomes genuinely unsettling. Because once scholars fully translated the Rosetta Stone, the result felt surprisingly ordinary. There were no hidden prophecies, no secret knowledge, no forbidden revelation. The artifact that unlocked the entire language of ancient Egypt turned out to contain what looked like little more than an official political decree praising a teenage king. Tax reforms, temple donations, military victories, ceremonial language, that was it. For 200 years, historians considered the matter settled. The Rosetta Stone was extraordinary because it decoded a civilization, not because of what the inscription itself actually said. The case appeared closed. Then the 21st century arrived, and everything changed again. A modern computational linguistic system was directed at the exact same inscription scholars had already translated, catalogued, and studied for generations. The expectation was simple: confirm the existing interpretation and move on. Instead, the system detected something nobody had seen before, and according to researchers, it was not subtle. At University College London, a team led by Dr. Marco Parale began running a large-scale computational analysis of the Rosetta Stone's 3 parallel texts. But unlike earlier scholars, the AI was not attempting a normal translation. It approached the inscription differently. The system analyzed statistical relationships between the Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic sections simultaneously, treating the stone less like a readable document and more like a structured data network. The researchers expected random inconsistencies, or perhaps nothing at all. That is not what happened. When the model returned its findings, certain discrepancies appeared repeatedly in the exact same sections of text. The differences were concentrated, directional, and strangely consistent. The pattern was impossible to ignore. According to colleagues present during the experiment, Dr. Parala printed the output, stared at it silently for several seconds, then finally said, "Run it again." They did. The same anomalies appeared in the same passages once more, again and again. At that point, the room reportedly went quiet, because the AI was no longer suggesting simple translation errors. It was pointing toward the possibility that the Greek and hieroglyphic versions were not perfectly identical at all. And then the AI uncovered something researchers could explain in surprisingly direct terms. In Section 14 of the decree, the part discussing the king's financial offerings to Egyptian temples, the hieroglyphic text repeats a very specific ceremonial construction 3 separate times within a short span. That immediately stood out, because in standard Ptolemaic-era Egyptian administrative writing, that kind of phrasing usually appears only once, and according to specialists in ancient priestly language, repeating that construction carries legal implications. It signals obligation, commitment, a binding promise, recognized under temple law rather than simple ceremonial praise. But the Greek version says something far softer. In the same section, the Greek text describes the king's actions using ordinary honorific language, polite, formal, almost routine. The kind of wording you would expect in a standard government proclamation. So suddenly, there was a very specific discrepancy. The Greek text essentially says, "The king gave generously to the temples." But the hieroglyphic version appears closer to, "The king is permanently obligated to support the temples under formal, sacred authority." That is not a small translation nuance. That is a fundamentally different level of meaning. And what makes the discovery even stranger is where these inconsistencies appear. The AI did not find random variations scattered throughout the inscription. The divergences clustered around one very specific subject: the balance of power between the monarchy and the priesthood. Whenever the decree discussed military victories, construction projects, or public celebrations, all 3 language versions matched almost perfectly. But every time the inscription turned toward temple privileges, sacred land ownership, priestly authority, or limits on royal control over religious property, the same structural discrepancies emerged again and again. 17 separate examples, same category, same directional shift. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Now, in ancient Egypt, this kind of layered communication would not necessarily have been shocking if it was intentional. Egyptian scribes were extraordinarily sophisticated intellectuals. Their training lasted decades, and they were skilled not only in writing itself, but in something scholars call diglossia, the practice of shaping language differently for different audiences within the same text. But nobody had ever seriously examined the Rosetta Stone from that perspective before. For more than 2 centuries, historians operated under one core assumption. All 3 versions of the inscription were direct equivalents of each other. The AI made no such assumption. Instead, it treated the Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphic sections as independent texts and asked a simple question. Do these versions actually say the same thing? The answer, at least according to the model, was no, not consistently, and not in the sections that mattered most, politically. What the system may have uncovered is something far more complicated than a simple royal decree. It may be evidence of a negotiation hidden inside ceremonial language. Historians already knew the Ptolemaic rulers faced an incredibly fragile political situation. These kings were foreign Greek-speaking descendants of Alexander the Great's empire, ruling over one of the oldest and most tradition-bound civilizations on Earth. To stay in power, they needed the support of Egypt's priestly elite, and those priests controlled enormous wealth. The temples were not merely religious centers. They controlled farmland, workshops, trade networks, taxation systems, and regional economies. Their influence was massive. The pharaohs needed public legitimacy. The priests needed guarantees. And according to this emerging theory, those guarantees may have been encoded directly into the Rosetta Stone itself, not in the Greek section meant for administrators and imperial officials, but in the hieroglyphic layer read primarily by the Egyptian priesthood. If that interpretation is correct, then the Rosetta Stone was never a single unified proclamation at all. It may have been 2 parallel agreements carved onto the same stone for 2 completely different audiences. Of course, not everyone agrees with this conclusion, and the criticism from scholars has been serious. Several leading Egyptologists have challenged the computational analysis directly. Among them is Dr. Penelope Wilson of Durham University, a respected specialist in Ptolemaic priestly texts. Wilson argues that repeated phrasing in Egyptian ceremonial writing was often stylistic rather than legal. In her view, scribes frequently used repetition for emphasis and rhythm, not necessarily to encode hidden contractual meaning. She also points out another important issue. The dataset may simply be too small. Unless the same AI system analyzes a much larger collection of comparable priestly decrees from the same period, it becomes difficult to know whether these patterns are genuinely unusual or merely normal features of ancient Egyptian writing. And that criticism raises a much bigger question about AI itself. Pattern detection systems are designed to find connections. That's what they do. Give a sufficiently advanced algorithm any massive body of text, and eventually it will uncover anomalies, irregularities, and statistical deviations. The real challenge is determining whether those patterns are meaningful or accidental. And with a cultural distance of more than 2,000 years, that becomes incredibly difficult, because intention is not something an algorithm can truly see. Then there's another complication. AI models learn from existing scholarship, which means they inherit the assumptions already embedded within centuries of academic interpretation. When the system identifies something as statistically strange, it is comparing that phrase against patterns built from earlier human translations and earlier scholarly frameworks. But what if some of those earlier interpretations were already incomplete? What if the foundation itself contains blind spots? In that case, the AI may not simply be uncovering hidden meanings inside the Rosetta Stone. It may also be exposing the limitations of modern scholarship itself. But here's the part that even many critics now admit is difficult to dismiss. The AI did uncover real textual irregularities, specific phrase groupings, specific cross-language inconsistencies, and almost all of them appear in sections dealing with temple power, priestly authority, and economic privileges connected to sacred institutions. Conventional linguistic explanations have not fully accounted for why those differences exist. That much is no longer really disputed. The argument now is about cause. Are these variations intentional, accidental, stylistic, political, ritualistic? That question, buried for 2 centuries beneath academic certainty, is suddenly alive again. And historically, some of archaeology's biggest breakthroughs began exactly this way, with something small that didn't quite belong. For centuries, humanity fought to recover the lost language carved into its surface. And now that we finally can read it, the Rosetta Stone seems to be asking one last question. What if the official translation was only ever part of the message? If this story changed the way you think about history, language, and the limits of what we assume we understand, subscribe and turn on notifications. Every week, we explore the place where ancient mysteries collide with modern technology and where the answers are rarely as simple as they first appear. The Rosetta Stone has waited more than 2,000 years to be understood, and we may only now be beginning to hear what it was really trying to say.